Yo, what is up guys? Delboy here, aka Blue Collar Sports TV. Hopefully you guys are doing well. If you're new here, smash that like, hit subscribe, all of that good stuff. So apologies for the lack of content in the last couple of days or so, but I've had a bout with the flu, but thankfully my Platinum Supreme Alpha immune system has pretty much beaten it. We are through the worst of it, so I thought why not make a video. And today's topic is Jaime Munguia versus Gabriel Rosado, a quick preview and prediction. Now, I really like this fight. Jaime Munguia, of course, a Mexican middleweight, former champion at 154, and Munguia is becoming one of my favourite fighters in the sport, purely from an entertainment perspective. And his opponent, Gabriel Rosado, is a tough gatekeeper, extremely experienced, coming off one of the best wins of his career against Bekdamir Melikuziev. And, he's one of those guys who, if you're world class, you'll beat Gabriel Rosado. But if you're not quite at that level, he will expose you. He's that sort of guy. And that's why I think this is a good fight for Munguia at this stage of his career. And all in all, on top of that, the stylistic matchup between these two should make for a fun fight. So I'm looking forward to this bout. But let's briefly break down the tale of the tape between these two fighters, and then we'll get into the prediction part of the video. So Jaime Munguia, he has a perfect record of 37-0, 30 of his 37 wins coming by way of knockout. Gabriel Rosado has a record of 26 wins, 13 defeats, 1 draw, 15 of his 26 wins coming by way of knockout. Jaime Munguia is listed as 6 foot with a 72-inch reach. Gabriel Rosado is listed as 5'11.5" with a 71.5-inch reach. So Munguia is slightly taller and slightly longer. He's got half an inch in reach and half an inch in height. So these guys are of a comparable size. Both of these guys are orthodox fighters. Jaime Munguia is still only 25 years old, whereas Gabriel Rosado is 35 years old. So Munguia is a fresher fighter. You would imagine he's got a lot more in the tank. However, on the flip side, despite these guys having a similar amount of fights, Gabriel Rosado is clearly more experienced. Rosado's shared the ring with the likes of Danny Jacobs, Gennady Golovkin, Jamel Charlo, Vanes Martirosyan. I mean, the guy's fought a lot of top fighters: Martin Murray, Peter Quillin, David Lemieux. I mean, Rosado's basically fought everybody in and around 160. So, yeah, Rosado's more experienced, but he is longer in the tooth. Will the freshness of Munguia be a bigger advantage, or will Rosado's experience be a bigger advantage? We'll see on fight night. But the tale of the tape is quite interesting. They are similar in a lot of aspects in terms of the pure size. They are comparable, so that's going to be interesting. But let's briefly break down what I believe each guy should do to win this fight. And at the end of the video, I will make my official prediction. So I guess I'll start with Munguia, who is the favourite in this fight. We all know how Munguia fights. Munguia is a come-forward fighter who throws a lot of punches. He's got very high output, and since he's moved to Eric Morales, Eric Morales is now his trainer, I have seen some subtle improvements in regards to his setup game, how he cuts the ring off, and even defensively, and he needs to be showing that in this fight against a veteran like Gabriel Rosado. Munguia in this bout, I don't think he can afford to neglect his jab. He can't afford to just walk in without really opening the door first, if that makes sense, because Rosado's just going to slam that door in his face. He's going to walk him on to counter punches, in particular the right hand. So Munguia needs to keep Rosado occupied as he's applying pressure. So I want to see a consistent jab from Munguia on the front foot, and behind that also feint on the front foot and try and stop Rosado in his tracks. Maybe try and bait Rosado with a little feint and then fire his own punches, kind of thing, because I do think Munguia is actually quicker than Gabriel Rosado, especially these days. So I think he's got the ability to do that. I have seen Munguia start throwing the odd feint here and there, something he didn't usually do back in his earlier fights. So basically I want to see a more consistent jab from Munguia, which he has been doing more in his recent fights. And I want to see him throw a couple of feints as well to keep Rosado guessing. And also behind that, I think Munguia does need to be a bit more defensively sound. Munguia, you would describe him as a typical Mexican-style fighter, stereotypically. And he likes to come forwards. He'll kind of take one to land free in his case. But I want to see Munguia be a little more attentive to his defense. Nothing special. Munguia's never going to be a guy who is like Mike Tyson, bobbing and weaving and things like that. But, just come forwards with a nice tight guard. Protect that head, protect that body as well. Come forward with a nice tight guard, fire the jab behind, out of the guard, and try and walk down Rosado in that high guard. I think Munguia is certainly capable of that. He has been showing improvements to his defense in recent fights, not only with his guard, but he's actually anticipating punches a lot better now. He's starting to roll with punches a little bit rather than just taking them flush. And he needs to show that in this fight. Those slight defensive improvements, he needs to be implementing them in this fight with Rosado. Because like I say, Rosado is an experienced veteran. And if he sees a mistake, he's the type of guy he'll punish you for it. And we saw that against Bektemir Melikuziev. Melikuziev started that fight really well. He hurt Rosado on a couple of occasions, dropped Rosado to the body, and at that point, Melikuziev completely lost respect for Rosado, and we saw what happened. Rosado took advantage of that and knocked him out cold. So Munguia needs to be aware of that in this fight. He needs to be aware that Rosado's been there, seen it, done it. He's seen it all before. And if Munguia makes those mistakes, Rosado will capitalise. So it's about, he needs to minimise those defensive flaws in this bout. And ultimately, he needs to force for pace on Gabriel Rosado. Rosado is the older man. He's coming back down to middleweight. So I think Munguia would be wise to work that body, obviously maintain a high work rate, which he always does, and make Rosado fight at his pace. Rosado these days is quite economical with his work, and if you fight at his pace, it can definitely frustrate you and even outbox you. We saw that against Danny Jacobs. He did a really good job boxing with Danny Jacobs in a low output fight. So Munguia can't let Rosado get into that sort of fight where he's touching, messing around, because you might lose rounds if you do that. He needs to make it a real high output fight, make Rosado fight at his pace, make the older man throw more punches than he wants to, work that body and drag Rosado into that sort of fight. Rosado is a tough guy. He has been in those wars before, but it comes a time to where you can't take that anymore. And I think we've seen Rosado slightly adjust his style in recent fights. He's much more economical, like I said. So Munguia needs to try and take Rosado back to the old Rosado where he was banging it out and really kind of fighting fire with fire. If he does that, if Munguia gets Rosado in that sort of fight, I think there's every chance you'll see Munguia just completely outwork Rosado in the exchanges and maybe even drown him late on. Ultimately, Munguia needs to be Munguia, but, just take a little more care in doing so. Ultimately, we all know how Munguia is going to fight, regardless of who he fights. He's going to be the pressure guy. So there's not too much to be said about Munguia's approach. As for Rosado, I think he's up against it in this fight. I know he's coming off a really good win over Bektemir Melikuziev, but he's definitely up against it. For me, in this fight, Rosado needs to be primarily fighting from range, adopting a back foot style in this particular bout. We saw Dennis Hogan give Munguia a lot of problems with that style, and I think Rosado needs to adopt something similar. To me, Rosado needs to keep this fight at arm's length. He needs to box behind that jab and try and be a stationary target. He needs to try and keep making Munguia reset so he can't land those combinations or throw those combinations. Primarily, Munguia has to set his feet before he throws those combinations. He is getting a bit better at throwing single shots on the front foot while he's coming forwards, but when you look at Munguia when he throws those combinations, primarily he's always flat-footed. So Rosado, in my opinion, needs to be negating those moments where Munguia can be set to punch. He needs to be giving Munguia little opportunity to land those combinations, and ultimately Rosado needs to mess Munguia around. I think if Rosado adopts that style and he's successful early on, I think then you could see Munguia start taking risks, and that's when Rosado's counterpunching comes into play, in particular that overhand right or the straight right, one of Rosado's best punches. And the opportunities will be there with Jaime Munguia. As he's getting frustrated or as he's becoming dominant, Munguia's defensive flaws do come through. The guard becomes rather wide and porous. Sometimes there's no guard and there's no head movement. So ultimately, I think it's down to Rosado to frustrate Munguia early on. Even if he's not necessarily winning rounds, I think Rosado needs to be trying to frustrate Munguia to draw out mistakes, and once the mistakes appear, that's when Rosado really needs to be letting go of that counter right hand, and he really needs to be stepping into it, try and hurt Munguia, try and make Munguia's forward momentum count against him, try and walk him onto a really big shot, because ultimately in this fight, I think Rosado's best chance is by stoppage. I can't see a fight where even if Rosado's having success messing Munguia around, I can't see a fight where Rosado outpoints Munguia in sufficient rounds to win this fight on points. So for me, Rosado needs to walk Munguia onto something really big. Another thing for Rosado, and again, don't make this a primary strategy, but he needs to be aware of Munguia's body. Vary the jab to the pit of the stomach as Munguia's coming forwards. Try and fire that straight right hand to the body on occasion as well. Just, chip away. Don't be crazy to the body, but when the opportunity is there, I think Rosado would be wise to throw a few body shots. And, to try and slow Munguia down. Munguia's the pressure fighter. Munguia's the guy who likes to throw a lot of shots. So try and chip a little bit out of that body. And lastly, as I mentioned earlier, I think Rosado needs to be moving in this fight and keeping Munguia unable to set his feet and punch. But one other thing I'd like to add in regards to Rosado moving on the back foot, I think the exit strategy for Rosado could be very important in this fight. Obviously, both guys are southpaws, and for me, if Rosado's going to box that sort of fight, I believe Rosado needs to be exiting to his own left, essentially to avoid the lead hand of Jaime Munguia, because especially when Munguia leads with power shots, usually it comes from his left side, his left hand, and usually that's a left hook to body or head. And if Rosado's exiting the other direction, he could be stopped in his tracks with that left hook to head or body, and then he's stationary for Munguia to really kind of unload and land a combination of punches. Ultimately, for me, Rosado needs to make his experience count in this fight. He needs to frustrate the younger man and then draw out mistakes and try and walk him onto a big shot. If that doesn't happen, I can't see Rosado winning this fight. I can't see Rosado winning this fight on points. Even if he does make it close somehow, is he going to get the decision? Probably not. So yeah, there we go. And as for the winner of this particular fight, I am picking Jaime Munguia. I believe Munguia will either win a competitive decision, potentially even a late stoppage. I know Rosado is very tough, but Munguia does throw a lot of shots. He does carry respectable power, and Rosado obviously now is 35 years old, had a lot of wars, had a lot of hard fights, so I wouldn't be shocked if we see a late stoppage. But regardless, I'm going with Munguia to win this fight. I think it's going to be fun. I think it's going to be relatively competitive in stages, but I think the safe bet is Munguia to win this fight. More than likely on points, but potentially a late stoppage. Anyway, share your thoughts below. It's been your guy Delboy. Once again, apologies for the lack of content, but we're getting back to normal, so expect more videos in the coming days. Share your thoughts below. Been your guy Delboy. Peace.